In a quiet Tennessee town, a 72-year-old widow was about to uncover a betrayal that would shatter everything she thought she knew about family. What started as a simple morning routine took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the devastating realization that her own daughter-in-law was systematically hiding her life-saving heart medication. Margaret Rose Whitaker wasn't your typical vulnerable senior citizen. For over 4 decades, she had spent her life as a school librarian, known for her razor-sharp mind and methodical approach to solving problems. When she encountered missing pills scattered throughout her home, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated scheme of elder abuse. Margaret's decision to fight back with everything she had would lead to a legal battle that would expose the dark side of family manipulation. What began as confusion over misplaced medication would become a fight for her very independence and dignity. The small Tennessee community would never be the same after witnessing how the most devastating betrayals often come, wrapped in the guise of love and protection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Rose Whitaker's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the small orange bottle that should have been sitting beside her coffee maker. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of her modest Tennessee kitchen, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum where Harold's work boots had once left muddy prints. 6 months since his funeral, and she still found herself setting out 2 coffee cups before catching herself. But this morning, something else was wrong. The bottle wasn't there. Margaret stared at the empty space beside the ceramic rooster Harold had bought her for their 20th anniversary. A gaudy thing she'd pretended to love because it made him smile. Her heart medication had been in that exact spot every morning for the past 3 years, ever since Dr. Patterson had prescribed the pills that kept her ticker running steady. She'd developed a ritual around it. Wake at 6:30, shuffle to the kitchen in her worn slippers, start the coffee, take the pill, then sit in Harold's old recliner to watch the sunrise paint the mountains. "Now, where did you wander off to?" she murmured, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came with 72 years of living. Margaret had always talked to herself, a habit formed during 40 years of working alone in the school library, organizing books and shushing rowdy children. Harold used to tease that she'd have full conversations with the furniture if he wasn't around to listen. The irony wasn't lost on her now. Margaret began her search methodically, the way she'd once helped frantic students locate misplaced research materials. Kitchen counter first. Nothing but the usual clutter of pill organizers, reading glasses, and unopened mail that Becca kept promising to help her sort through. The windowsill above the sink held only her collection of small potted herbs, their leaves catching the morning light like green confetti. She moved to the bathroom, checking the medicine cabinet where she kept her other prescriptions. Blood pressure medication, calcium supplements, the sleeping pills she rarely touched, all accounted for. But no heart medication. A flutter of anxiety sparked in her chest, the kind that came when she couldn't find her car keys or misplaced her reading glasses. Except this was different. This was the medication that kept her alive. Margaret returned to the kitchen and opened every cabinet, even the ones she knew were wrong. Behind canned peaches and dusty serving dishes, she found nothing. The flutter in her chest intensified, becoming a more insistent rhythm that reminded her why she needed those pills in the first place. Then she spotted it, a flash of orange tucked behind the sugar canister, almost hidden from view. Relief washed over her as she reached for the bottle, but confusion quickly followed. How had it gotten there? She distinctly remembered placing it beside the coffee maker before bed, the way she had every night for 3 years. Margaret unscrewed the cap with fingers that weren't quite steady. 2 pills missing from yesterday's count. That was right. But as she shook one into her palm and swallowed it with lukewarm coffee, unease settled in her stomach like a stone. The sound of a key turning in the front door interrupted her thoughts. Becca's voice drifted through the house, bright and cheerful as always. Good morning, Mama Rose. I brought fresh biscuits from Sullivan's Bakery. Margaret had never quite gotten used to being called Mama Rose, though Becca had insisted on it since marrying Danny 12 years ago. It felt too intimate, too presumptuous for a woman who still sometimes felt like a stranger, despite sharing Sunday dinners and family holidays. In the kitchen, dear, Margaret called back, deciding not to mention the misplaced medication. Perhaps she had moved it herself in some late-night fog of grief and exhaustion. The mind played tricks after loss. Dr. Patterson had warned her about that. Becca appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail despite the early hour. At 38, she maintained the kind of put-together appearance that Margaret had never quite mastered, even in her younger days. Today, she wore crisp jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. "How are we feeling this morning?" Becca asked, setting a paper bag on the counter and immediately beginning to tidy up. She had a compulsive need to straighten things, rearranging Margaret's belongings with the efficiency of someone used to being in control. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, watching as Becca moved her coffee cup to the sink and wiped down the already clean counter. "Just had a little trouble finding my heart pills this morning. Found them behind the sugar, of all places." Becca paused in her cleaning, her back to Margaret. When she turned, her expression was carefully neutral. "Oh my, that's concerning. Do you remember putting them there?" "No, Margaret frowned, trying to recall the previous evening. She'd taken her nighttime medications, watched the news, then come to the kitchen for a glass of water before bed. Had she moved the bottle then? "I thought I left them in their usual spot. Memory can be tricky when we're grieving," Becca said gently, but something in her tone made Margaret's skin prickle. "Maybe we should think about getting you one of those weekly pill organizers, to help keep track of everything." Margaret bristled at the suggestion. She'd been managing her own medications just fine. "Thank you very much. I don't need organizing, Rebecca. I need my pills where I put them." The use of her full name was deliberate, a small rebellion against the assumption of incompetence. But Becca either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Of course, Mama Rose. I'm just worried about you, that's all. Living alone in this big house, keeping track of everything." Becca's voice carried the kind of concern that sounded genuine but felt rehearsed. "Maybe I should start coming by more often, just to check on things." Margaret wanted to protest that the house wasn't big, just a modest 2-bedroom ranch that she and Harold had bought when Danny was small. Wanted to say that she'd been keeping track of things just fine for 7 decades and didn't need supervision now. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by the uncomfortable possibility that maybe Becca was right. Maybe she was losing track of things. The thought terrified her more than she cared to admit. Margaret had watched her own mother fade into confusion in her final years, had seen the vacant look that crept into familiar eyes as memories slipped away like water through cupped hands. The idea that she might be following the same path made her stomach clench with something deeper than morning hunger. "I'm managing just fine," she said finally, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Becca smiled and patted Margaret's shoulder, with the kind of gentle condescension reserved for children and the elderly. "I know you are, honey, but it wouldn't hurt to have a little extra help, would it? I could come by every few days. Maybe help organize your medications, sort through some of Harold's things." The mention of Harold's belongings made Margaret's chest tighten in a different way. His clothes still hung in their shared closet. His tools still cluttered the garage workbench. She wasn't ready to sort through 45 years of shared life, wasn't ready to decide what deserved keeping and what could be discarded like outdated periodicals in the library stacks. "I'll think about it," Margaret said, though she had no intention of doing any such thing. Becca seemed satisfied with this non-commitment. She bustled around the kitchen for a few more minutes, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging and offering suggestions about groceries and household repairs that Margaret filed away without comment. When she finally left with promises to check in again soon, Margaret sat in the sudden quiet and tried to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the kitchen with honey-colored light that should have been comforting. Instead, Margaret found herself staring at the spot where her medication had been, wondering if her mind was playing tricks or if something else was at work. She thought about Harold, about how he used to leave her little notes when he traveled for construction jobs. "Missing you already," he'd write, tucking them into her coffee canister or between the pages of whatever book she was reading. Sweet. Gestures from a man who showed love through actions rather than words. But Harold was gone, and no one else had reason to move her things. Did they? Margaret rose from her chair, decision crystallizing in her mind with the same clarity she'd once used to help confused students navigate the card catalog system. If her memory was failing, she needed to know. And if it wasn't, if someone was deliberately moving her medication, she needed to know that too. Starting today, she would pay attention. She would document everything, the way she'd once tracked overdue books and missing library materials. Because Margaret Rose Whitaker hadn't spent 4 decades organizing information just to let confusion reign in her own life. Her heart gave a small flutter as she reached for a notebook from the kitchen drawer, but this time it felt less like anxiety and more like determination. Whatever was happening to her pills, she was going to find out. Even if the answer frightened her more than the question itself. Margaret's hand tightened on the small notebook as she finished writing her first entry. Monday, March 15th. Heart medication found behind sugar canister. No memory of placing it there. The ink looked stark. Against the lined paper, evidence of something she couldn't yet name but felt in her bones like approaching weather. 3 days had passed since that morning, and she'd found her pills in increasingly odd places. Wednesday, tucked behind the flour jar. Thursday, nestled between cookbooks she hadn't touched in months. Each discovery came with the same flutter of panic, followed by the same careful documentation in her growing log. The sound of Danny's truck in the driveway made her close the notebook and slip it into the kitchen drawer beneath a stack of dish towels. She wasn't ready to share her suspicions, wasn't even sure they qualified as suspicions rather than the paranoid imaginings of a grief-addled mind. "Mama?" Danny's voice carried through the screen door, warm with the Tennessee drawl that reminded her so much of Harold. At 40, her son still called before entering, a courtesy that had somehow survived his childhood and 2 decades of marriage. "Come on in, honey." Margaret smoothed her blouse and tried to arrange her face into something approaching normalcy. She'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror, testing expressions that didn't betray the growing unease that had taken up residence in her chest like a second heartbeat. Danny entered first, his work shirt still bearing traces of sawdust from the furniture factory where he supervised the 3rd shift. Behind him came Becca, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of concerned smile that Margaret was beginning to recognize as performance art. "We brought dinner," Becca announced, setting the dish on the counter with the proprietary air of someone claiming territory. "That chicken and rice recipe you used to love, Mama Rose." Though I did add a few of my own touches. Margaret wanted to point out that she'd never particularly loved chicken and rice, that it had been Harold's favorite and she'd made it to please him. But correcting Becca felt petty, especially when her daughter-in-law was going to such trouble. "That's very thoughtful, dear." Margaret accepted Danny's kiss on her cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of Old Spice and honest work. "How was your shift?" "Long," Danny said, settling into Harold's old chair at the kitchen table. The sight still made Margaret's heart skip, seeing her son in his father's place, filling a space that had seemed impossibly large just months ago. New contract came in from Nashville. Custom dining sets for some fancy hotel chain. Becca began unpacking items from her oversized purse with the efficiency of a field medic setting up a triage station. Pill organizer, blood pressure cuff, a small notebook that looked suspiciously official. Margaret watched with growing alarm as her daughter-in-law transformed the kitchen table into a makeshift medical station. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," Becca said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "About the medication mix-ups. I did some research online, talked to a friend who works at the senior center." "What kind of research?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Early signs of cognitive decline," Becca said gently, as if delivering news of a minor cold rather than a devastating diagnosis. "Memory lapses, confusion about familiar routines, misplacing important items. It's actually very common in people our age. Your age, I mean, especially after experiencing significant loss." The phrase, "people our age," hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring truck. Margaret felt something sharp and defensive rise in her chest, the same feeling she'd gotten when parents questioned her competence as a librarian because she was just a woman, or when doctors spoke to Harold, instead of her about her own medical care. "I'm 72, not 92, Margaret said, her voice carrying an edge she hadn't intended. "And I've been managing my own medications just fine." Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between his wife and mother like a referee at a tennis match. "Mama, Becca's just trying to help. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to have a little extra support." The word support felt like a trap disguised as kindness. Margaret had raised this man, had packed his lunches and helped with homework, and taught him to drive on the back roads behind their house. Now he sat in his father's chair, suggesting she needed supervision like a child who couldn't be trusted with sharp objects. "What kind of support?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. Becca opened her notebook with the flourish of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "I've been keeping track of concerning incidents. The medication confusion, of course. Last week you forgot to turn off the stove after making tea. I noticed when I came by to check on you. And Danny mentioned you seemed confused about which day his father died when he called on Sunday." Margaret's breath caught. She remembered that phone call, remembered the moment of disorientation when Danny had mentioned something about 3 months ago today. But she'd been thinking about Harold's birthday, not his death, had been caught up in the memory of their last celebration together. The confusion had lasted only seconds, but apparently long enough for Danny to file it away as evidence of decline. "That's not," Margaret began, but Becca was already continuing. "I've researched some excellent assisted living facilities in the area. Beautiful places, really, like hotels with medical staff. You'd have your own apartment, but with people to help manage medications, prepare meals, handle emergencies." The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if Margaret were standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Assisted living. The phrase conjured images of shuffleboard and bingo nights, of giving up her home and her independence and becoming just another elderly resident waiting for visiting hours. "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "This is my home. Harold and I built our life here." "Of course you did," Becca agreed, her tone dripping with the kind of patience usually reserved for obstinate children. "But Harold isn't here anymore to help look after things, and we're worried about you living alone, especially with these memory issues." Danny nodded, though he looked about as comfortable as a man sitting on fire ants. "Maybe we could start small, just having someone check on you more regularly. Make sure you're taking your medications correctly, help with groceries." Margaret wanted to scream that she'd been taking care of herself and others for 7 decades, that she'd managed a library budget and supervised teenage volunteers and kept Harold's construction business books balanced when his arthritis made writing difficult. Instead, she found herself studying her son's face, searching for the boy who used to defend her against playground bullies and tell her she was the smartest person he knew. "I can take care of myself," she said quietly. "Can you, though?" Becca's voice carried just enough doubt to plant seeds of uncertainty. "When's the last time you balanced your checkbook?" Or cleaned the gutters? Or even drove further than the grocery store? Each question felt like a small blade, cutting away pieces of Margaret's confidence. It was true that she hadn't driven to Nashville since Harold's funeral. True that she'd been putting off maintenance tasks that once seemed routine. But grief wasn't the same thing as incompetence, was it? I think, Becca continued, it would be best if I started coming by daily. Just to make sure you're staying on top of things. Maybe I could organize your medications, help sort through some of Harold's belongings. There it was again, the suggestion about Harold's things. Margaret had noticed Becca's eyes lingering on certain items during her visits. The antique clock on the mantel, the collection of Depression-era glassware that had belonged to Margaret's mother, the tools in the garage that were probably worth more than Danny made in a month. That won't be necessary, Margaret said firmly. Mama! Danny's voice carried a pleading note that reminded her of when he was 8 years old and trying to negotiate a later bedtime. We're just trying to help. We love you. Love. The word hung between them like a bridge that might collapse under too much weight. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, defeat in the slope of his shoulders. When had he become so worn down? When had he started deferring to his wife in matters that should have been family decisions? I know you do, Margaret said finally, but I need some time to think about all this. Becca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. But while you're thinking, maybe I could at least help organize your medications? Set up a proper system so there's no more confusion? Before Margaret could object, Becca was already moving toward the cabinet where the pill bottles lived, her hands reaching for Margaret's private business with the casual confidence of someone who believed she had the right. Please don't, Margaret said, but her voice came out smaller than intended. Becca paused, her hand on the cabinet door. I'm just trying to help, Mama Rose. We all are. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Margaret felt the weight of their expectations, the pressure to surrender pieces of herself in the name of safety and care. Part of her, the tired, grieving part, wanted to give in, to let someone else make the decisions and carry the responsibility. But another part, the part that had fought budget cuts at the library and stood up to school board members who tried to ban books, refused to go quietly into that managed twilight. I appreciate your concern, Margaret said carefully, but I'm not ready for that level of assistance. Danny looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Margaret's tone must have warned him off. Becca's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened like glass cooling too quickly. Well, Becca said, finally releasing the cabinet door. The offer stands. When you're ready. They stayed for dinner, making small talk about work and weather while the chicken and rice grew cold on Margaret's plate. She found herself picking at the food, her appetite lost somewhere between cognitive decline and assisted living. Every bite tasted like sawdust mixed with good intentions. When they finally left, with promises to check in tomorrow, Margaret stood in her quiet kitchen and felt the house settle around her like old bones finding rest. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed protective, a buffer against well-meaning invasions and concerned interventions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She pulled out her notebook and made another entry. Evening, March 18th, family meeting. Becca suggested assisted living, offered to manage medications. Danny agreed, felt pressured to surrender independence. As she wrote, Margaret noticed her handwriting was steady, her thoughts clear and organized. Whatever was happening with her medication, whatever game was being played, her mind remained sharp enough to recognize the difference between genuine concern and something else entirely. Something that felt more like a carefully orchestrated campaign to prove her incompetent. Margaret closed the notebook and looked around her kitchen, Harold's coffee mug still sitting on the windowsill, her herbs growing in their neat little pots. Everything exactly as she'd arranged it. This was her domain, her sanctuary, her life. And she wasn't giving it up without a fight. Margaret's hand tightened on the small notebook as she finished writing her first entry. Monday, March 15th. Heart medication found behind sugar canister. No memory of placing it there. The ink looked stark against the lined paper, evidence of something she couldn't yet name but felt in her bones like approaching weather. 3 days had passed since that morning, and she'd found her pills in increasingly odd places. Wednesday, tucked behind the flour jar. Thursday, nestled between cookbooks she hadn't touched in months. Each discovery came with the same flutter of panic, followed by the same careful documentation in her growing log. The sound of Danny's truck in the driveway made her close the notebook and slip it into the kitchen drawer beneath a stack of dish towels. She wasn't ready to share her suspicions, wasn't even sure they qualified as suspicions, rather than the paranoid imaginings of a grief-addled mind. "Mama?" Danny's voice carried through the screen door, warm with the Tennessee drawl, that reminded her so much of Harold. At 40, her son still called before entering, a courtesy that had somehow survived his childhood and 2 decades of marriage. "Come on in, honey." Margaret smoothed her blouse and tried to arrange her face into something approaching normalcy. She'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror, testing expressions that didn't betray the growing unease that had taken up residence in her chest like a second heartbeat. Danny entered first, his work shirt still bearing traces of sawdust from the furniture factory where he supervised the 3rd shift. Behind him came Becca, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of concerned smile that Margaret was beginning to recognize as performance art. "We brought dinner," Becca announced, setting the dish on the counter with the proprietary air of someone claiming territory. "That chicken and rice recipe you used to love, Mama Rose. Though I did add a few of my own touches." Margaret wanted to point out that she'd never particularly loved chicken and rice, that it had been Harold's favorite and she'd made it to please him. But correcting Becca felt petty, especially when her daughter-in-law was going to such trouble. "That's very thoughtful, dear." Margaret accepted Danny's kiss on her cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of Old Spice and honest work. "How was your shift?" "Long," Danny said, settling into Harold's old chair at the kitchen table. The sight still made Margaret's heart skip, seeing her son in his father's place, filling a space that had seemed impossibly large just months ago. New contract came in from Nashville, custom dining sets for some fancy hotel chain. Becca began unpacking items from her oversized purse with the efficiency of a field medic setting up a triage station. Pill organizer, blood pressure cuff, a small notebook that looked suspiciously official. Margaret watched with growing alarm as her daughter-in-law transformed the kitchen table into a makeshift medical station. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," Becca said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "About the medication mix-ups. I did some research online, talked to a friend who works at the senior center." "What kind of research?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Early signs of cognitive decline," Becca said gently, as if delivering news of a minor cold rather than a devastating diagnosis. "Memory lapses, confusion about familiar routines, misplacing important items. It's actually very common in people our age. Your age, I mean, especially after experiencing significant loss." The phrase, "people our age," hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring truck. Margaret felt something sharp and defensive rise in her chest. The same feeling she'd gotten when parents questioned her competence as a librarian because she was just a woman, or when doctors spoke to Harold instead of her about her own medical care. "I'm 72, not 92, Margaret said, her voice carrying an edge she hadn't intended. "And I've been managing my own medications just fine." Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between his wife and mother like a referee at a tennis match. "Mama," Becca's just trying to help. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to have a little extra support. The word support felt like a trap disguised as kindness. Margaret had raised this man, had packed his lunches and helped with homework and taught him to drive on the back roads behind their house. Now he sat in his father's chair, suggesting she needed supervision like a child who couldn't be trusted, with sharp objects. "What kind of support?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. Becca opened her notebook with the flourish of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "I've been keeping track of concerning incidents. The medication confusion, of course. Last week you forgot to turn off the stove after making tea. I noticed when I came by to check on you, and Danny mentioned you seemed confused about which day his father died when he called on Sunday." Margaret's breath caught. She remembered that phone call, remembered the moment of disorientation when Danny had mentioned something about 3 months ago today. But she'd been thinking about Harold's birthday, not his death, had been caught up in the memory of their last celebration together. The confusion had lasted only seconds, but apparently long enough for Danny to file it away as evidence of decline. "That's not," Margaret began, but Becca was already continuing. "I've researched some excellent assisted living facilities in the area. Beautiful places, really, like hotels with medical staff. You'd have your own apartment, but with people to help manage medications, prepare meals, handle emergencies." The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if Margaret were standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Assisted living. The phrase conjured images of shuffleboard and bingo nights, of giving up her home and her independence and becoming just another elderly resident waiting for visiting hours. "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "This is my home. Harold and I built our life here." "Of course you did," Becca agreed, her tone dripping with the kind of patience usually reserved for obstinate children. "But Harold isn't here anymore to help look after things. And we're worried about you living alone, especially with these memory issues." Danny nodded, though he looked about as comfortable as a man sitting on fire ants. "Maybe we could start small, just having someone check on you more regularly. Make sure you're taking your medications correctly, help with groceries." Margaret wanted to scream that she'd been taking care of herself and others for 7 decades, that she'd managed a library budget and supervised teenage volunteers, and kept Harold's construction business books balanced when his arthritis made writing difficult. Instead, she found herself studying her son's face, searching for the boy who used to defend her against playground bullies and tell her she was the smartest person he knew. "I can take care of myself," she said quietly. "Can you, though?" Becca's voice carried just enough doubt to plant seeds of uncertainty. "When's the last time you balanced your checkbook? Or cleaned the gutters? Or even drove further than the grocery store?" Each question felt like a small blade, cutting away pieces of Margaret's confidence. It was true that she hadn't driven to Nashville since Harold's funeral. True that she'd been putting off maintenance tasks that once seemed routine. But grief wasn't the same thing as incompetence, was it? "I think," Becca continued, "it would be best if I started coming by daily, just to make sure you're staying on top of things. Maybe I could organize your medications, help sort through some of Harold's belongings." There it was again, the suggestion about Harold's things. Margaret had noticed Becca's eyes lingering on certain items during her visits. The antique clock on the mantel, the collection of Depression-era glassware that had belonged to Margaret's mother, the tools in the garage that were probably worth more than Danny made in a month. "That won't be necessary," Margaret said firmly. "Mama." Danny's voice carried a pleading note that reminded her of when he was 8 years old and trying to negotiate a later bedtime. "We're just trying to help. We love you." Love. The word hung between them like a bridge that might collapse. Under too much weight. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, defeat in the slope of his shoulders. When had he become so worn down? When had he started deferring to his wife in matters that should have been family decisions? "I know you do," Margaret said finally. "But I need some time to think about all this." Becca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But while you're thinking, maybe I could at least help organize your medications? Set up a proper system so there's no more confusion?" Before Margaret could object, Becca was already moving toward the cabinet where the pill bottles lived, her hands reaching for Margaret's private business with the casual confidence of someone who believed she had the right. "Please don't," Margaret said, but her voice came out smaller than intended. Becca paused, her hand on the cabinet door. "I'm just trying to help, Mama Rose. We all are." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Margaret felt the weight of their expectations, the pressure to surrender pieces of herself in the name of safety and care. Part of her, the tired, grieving part, wanted to give in, to let someone else make the decisions and carry the responsibility. But another part, the part that had fought budget cuts at the library and stood up to school board members who tried to ban books, refused to go quietly into that managed twilight. "I appreciate your concern," Margaret said carefully, "but I'm not ready for that level of assistance." Danny looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Margaret's tone must have warned him off. Becca's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened like glass cooling too quickly. "Well," Becca said, finally releasing the cabinet door, "the offer stands when you're ready." They stayed for dinner, making small talk about work and weather while the chicken and rice grew cold on Margaret's plate. She found herself picking at the food, her appetite lost somewhere between cognitive decline and assisted living. Every bite tasted like sawdust mixed with good intentions. When they finally left, with promises to check in tomorrow, Margaret stood in her quiet kitchen and felt the house settle around her like old bones finding rest. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed protective, a buffer against well-meaning invasions and concerned interventions. She pulled out her notebook and made another entry. Evening, March 18th, family meeting. Becca suggested assisted living, offered to manage medications. Danny agreed, felt pressured to surrender independence. As she wrote, Margaret noticed her handwriting was steady, her thoughts clear and organized. Whatever was happening with her medication, whatever game was being played, her mind remained sharp enough to recognize the difference between genuine concern and something else entirely. Something that felt more like a carefully orchestrated campaign to prove her incompetent. Margaret closed the notebook and looked around her kitchen, Harold's coffee mug still sitting on the windowsill, her herbs growing in their neat little pots, everything exactly as she'd arranged it. This was her domain, her sanctuary, her life, and she wasn't giving it up without a fight. Frank Morrison's office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same oak furniture Harold had admired, same law books lining the walls like soldiers at attention, same smell of leather and old paper that reminded Margaret of the library stacks where she'd once felt most at home. But today, the familiar space felt like a war room, and Frank's expression suggested the battle had already begun. "Margaret, sit down," Frank said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His usually warm demeanor had been replaced by the grim professionalism she'd seen him use with difficult cases. "What I'm about to tell you isn't going to be easy to hear." Margaret settled into the worn leather chair and folded her hands in her lap, the same way she'd composed herself before delivering bad news to parents about their children's library behavior. Some conversations required armor, even if it was only the illusion of calm. "Becca lost her job at First National Bank 6 weeks ago," Frank began, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "Not laid off, terminated, for accessing customer accounts without authorization." The words hit Margaret like cold water. Customer accounts? She was looking up financial information on elderly clients. The bank's internal investigation. Found she'd accessed dozens of accounts belonging to seniors, including some who later complained about unusual activity. Frank's voice carried the weight of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She was fired but not prosecuted. The bank didn't want the publicity. Margaret opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Bank statements, credit reports, employment records. Frank had assembled a dossier that painted a picture of financial desperation she'd never suspected. Becca's credit card debt totaled nearly $40,000, spread across 8 different cards. Shopping expenses that seemed to escalate monthly, department stores, online retailers, luxury purchases that didn't match the modest lifestyle she presented to the family. "How did you get all this?" Margaret asked. "I have a friend who works in banking compliance. Once I explained the situation, she was able to confirm some things through official channels. The rest." Frank shrugged. "Let's just say people talk when they're worried about elderly clients." Margaret studied a credit card statement showing a $3,000 purchase at a jewelry store just 2 weeks ago. "Danny doesn't know any of this?" "I doubt it. Becca's been very careful to keep the bills hidden. But Margaret, it gets worse." Frank leaned forward, his expression grave. "She's been researching your financial situation. My contact at the bank says she made inquiries about your accounts, your investments, even Harold's life insurance payout." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, feeling the solid wood beneath her fingers like an anchor in rough seas. She was planning this, for months at minimum, maybe longer. Frank pulled out another document, a printed email that made Margaret's stomach drop. She sent this to a company that specializes in helping families get guardianship over elderly relatives. Margaret read the email with growing horror. Becca had described Margaret as increasingly confused and unable to manage her medications safely, had mentioned concerning incidents of forgetfulness and dangerous behaviors that put her at risk. The language was clinical, persuasive, and utterly damning. "She's building a legal case," Margaret whispered, "a very thorough one. If this went to court tomorrow, she'd have documentation of medication mismanagement, family testimony about concerning behaviors, and a paper trail of incidents that paint you as incompetent." Frank's voice was gentle but unflinching. "The fact that you're sitting here having this conversation proves she's wrong, but proving that in court would be an uphill battle." Margaret thought about Detective Chen's words about family members, creating evidence of incompetence. Becca hadn't just been moving medication. She'd been systematically destroying Margaret's credibility while positioning herself as the concerned caregiver forced to take action. "What does she get if she succeeds?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning to understand the scope of what she stood to lose. Frank consulted another document. "Conservatorship would give her control over your finances, your living situation, your medical care, everything. She could sell your house, liquidate your investments, even institutionalize you against your will." He paused, letting the full impact sink in. "Your estate is worth approximately $2 million, Margaret. That's a powerful motive." The number hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Margaret had known she and Harold were comfortable, but hearing their life's work reduced to a dollar amount that could motivate betrayal felt like a violation of something sacred. "She can't just take it, though. There are laws." "There are laws," Frank agreed, "but they're designed to protect vulnerable adults from abuse, and they can be manipulated by someone who understands the system." Becca worked at a bank. She knows exactly how financial conservatorship works. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. The screen showed Becca's name and a message that made her blood chill. "Stopped by to check on you, but you weren't home. Hope you're not driving too far alone. Let me know you're safe." The casual concern felt different now, loaded with implications about Margaret's ability to make independent decisions. Even her trip to Frank's office was being framed as evidence of poor judgment. "She's watching me," Margaret said, showing Frank the message. "Of course she is. She needs to document any behavior that supports her narrative. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret with the sharp eyes that had made him successful in family law. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Before Margaret could answer, her phone rang. Detective Chen's number appeared on the screen, and Frank gestured for her to answer on speaker. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm glad I caught you. I've been talking to your neighbors about the incidents you reported." Chen's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd found important evidence. "Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned seeing your daughter-in-law going through your mailbox several times over the past month. She thought it was odd but didn't want to interfere in family business." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Going through my mail? More than that. Mrs. Patterson saw her taking items from the box and photographing them with her phone before putting them back. Financial statements, insurance documents, anything that looked official. Frank was already making notes, his pen moving quickly across a legal pad. This was evidence of mail tampering, possibly theft, certainly invasion of privacy. The kind of concrete proof that could support criminal charges. "There's more," Chen continued. "I spoke with your mailman, Jerry Mills. He's been delivering to your route for 15 years, and he noticed your daughter-in-law intercepting him several times recently. She told him she was helping you manage your affairs, but he found it unusual that she specifically asked about financial mail." Margaret thought about all the statements and bills she'd assumed were late, all the important documents that had seemed to disappear before she could review them. Becca hadn't just been moving medication, she'd been controlling the flow of information, isolating Margaret from her own financial life. "Detective Chen," Frank interjected. "This is Frank Morrison, Mrs. Whitaker's attorney. What you're describing sounds like mail fraud in addition to elder abuse." "That's exactly what I'm thinking. Mrs. Whitaker, I need you to be very careful over the next few days. If your daughter-in-law realizes we're investigating, she might escalate her behavior. People who are desperate sometimes make dangerous decisions." After Chen hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet of Frank's office and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. Becca wasn't just a daughter-in-law with concerns. She was a calculating predator who'd been systematically dismantling Margaret's independence for months. "Frank," Margaret said slowly, "what happens to Emma in all this? If her mother is arrested?" "That's something to think about, but not something that should stop you from protecting yourself. Emma seems like a smart kid. She'll probably be better off away from someone capable of elder abuse." Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time it was Danny. "Mom, Becca says you weren't home when she checked on you. Where are you? We're worried." The text felt like a trap disguised as concern. Margaret showed it to Frank, who shook his head grimly. "They're going to use your absence as evidence that you're becoming unpredictable, possibly unsafe to live alone." Frank stood and moved to his window, looking out at the small Tennessee town where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Margaret, I think it's time to force their hand." "What do you mean?" "Go home, act normal. But tonight set up a small test. Leave your medication in the usual spot and see if it gets moved. If it does, we'll have our smoking gun." Margaret felt a chill at the thought of deliberately putting herself at risk, but she understood the logic. They needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as forgetfulness or coincidence. And if she escalates? If she tries something more dangerous? Frank returned to his desk and pulled out a business card. "Detective Chen gave me this number for emergency contact. If anything happens, anything at all, you call her immediately. Don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself. Don't worry about family harmony." As Margaret prepared to leave, Frank walked her to the door with the protective manner of someone escorting a witness into dangerous territory. "Margaret, I want you to remember something. You're not the one destroying this family. You're the one trying to save yourself from destruction. There's a difference, and it matters." The drive home felt like entering enemy territory. Margaret's own house, the place where she'd raised her son and buried her husband, now felt like a battlefield where every corner might hide evidence of betrayal. She found Becca's car in the driveway, and through the kitchen window, she could see her daughter-in-law moving around inside with the proprietary air of someone who already considered herself the rightful owner. Margaret sat in her car for a moment, gathering courage like armor. Tonight she would set Frank's trap. Tonight she would find out just how far Becca was willing to go. But as she watched Becca organizing her kitchen cabinets through the window, Margaret realized that somewhere in the process of fighting for her independence, she'd already discovered something more valuable than proof of wrongdoing. She'd rediscovered her own strength. The woman who walked up her front steps wasn't the confused, vulnerable target Becca thought she was manipulating. She was Margaret Rose Whitaker, librarian, investigator, and survivor. And she was about to teach her daughter-in-law that some people fought back harder when cornered. The only question now was whether Becca was smart enough to recognize when she'd picked the wrong victim. Margaret's key turned in the lock just as Becca emerged from the kitchen, her face arranged in an expression of carefully calibrated concern that Margaret now recognized as performance art. "Mama Rose, there you are. I was so worried when you didn't answer your phone." Becca's voice carried just the right note of relief mixed with gentle reproach. "Where were you?" "Doctor's appointment." Margaret lied smoothly, surprised by how easily the deception came. 3 days ago, she would have felt guilty about misleading family. Now she understood that truth was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Oh, honey, you should have told me. I could have driven you." Becca moved closer, her eyes scanning Margaret's face with the intensity of someone searching for signs of decline. "Did you remember to take your medication this morning?" The question felt like a test. Margaret nodded, acutely aware of the bottle she'd deliberately left beside the coffee maker before visiting Frank. "Of course I did." "Good, good." Becca's smile seemed forced. "I've been organizing your kitchen while I waited, making sure everything's in its proper place." Margaret felt her jaw clench. "I didn't ask you to organize anything." "I know, but with everything you've been going through." Becca's voice took on that patronizing tone Margaret was learning to hate. "Sometimes we need help seeing when things are getting out of hand." The kitchen looked different. Too clean, too organized, with the sterile perfection of someone imposing order where none was needed. Margaret's herbs had been moved from the windowsill to the counter. Her coffee canister sat in a different spot. Small changes that sent a clear message. This space no longer belonged entirely to Margaret. "Becca, I need you to stop rearranging my things." "Of course." Becca's agreement came too quickly, too smoothly. "I just want to help." The front door opened with the sharp bang that announced Danny's arrival. He entered the kitchen still, wearing his work clothes, sawdust in his hair and exhaustion around his eyes. Margaret felt her heart constrict at the sight of her son. When had he started looking so worn down? "Mom, thank God you're okay." Danny's relief seemed genuine as he kissed her cheek. "When Becca couldn't find you, we thought—" "You thought—" "What?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Danny and Becca exchanged a look that spoke of conversations Margaret hadn't been part of, decisions made about her without her input. "We were worried you might have gotten confused about where you were going," Becca said gently. "It happens sometimes with people your age." People your age. The phrase landed like a slap. Margaret looked at her son, searching for the boy who used to defend her against playground bullies, and found instead a man who seemed willing to let his wife speak for him. "I wasn't confused," Margaret said firmly. "I went to see Dr. Patterson about my heart medication. I'm perfectly capable of keeping my own appointments." Another lie, but one that served to test their reactions. Becca's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly, and Margaret caught the subtle calculation happening behind them. "Of course you are," Becca said. "But maybe it would be better if someone went with you next time, just for safety." Safety, the word, had become a weapon, used to strip away piece after piece of Margaret's independence. She was about to respond when rapid footsteps on the front porch announced Emma's arrival. "Grandma Maggie!" Emma burst through the door with the energy of youth and barely contained anger. "Dad, you said I couldn't come over, but I walked anyway. You can't just decide I can't see my grandmother." Margaret felt a surge of pride at her granddaughter's defiance. At 16, Emma already possessed more backbone than her father seemed capable of mustering. "Emma, honey," Becca's voice carried a warning note. "Your grandmother has had a very tiring day. Maybe I should what?" Emma's voice rose with teenage indignation. "Visit my own grandmother in her own house?" "Emma." Danny's voice carried the weariness of someone caught between competing loyalties. "Your mother's right. We need to be considerate of your grandmother's needs." "My needs?" Margaret found her voice, felt it growing stronger with anger. "My need is to see my granddaughter whenever I want. My need is to live in my own house, without someone rearranging my belongings and questioning my every movement." The kitchen fell silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Margaret could feel the fault lines in her family beginning to crack wide open. Emma broke the silence, her young voice carrying a moral clarity that shamed the adults around her. "Mom, I found Grandma Maggie's heart pills in your purse." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward until they touched everything. Margaret felt her heart stop, then start again with painful intensity. Becca's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, then a kind of desperate defiance. "Emma, you went through my purse? I was looking for gum, and I saw the pill bottle." Emma's voice was steady despite the enormity of what she was revealing. "Why do you have Grandma Maggie's medication?" Becca looked around the kitchen like a trapped animal seeking escape. "I was helping organize them, making sure she didn't take too many by mistake." "By hiding them?" Emma's question cut through Becca's explanation like a knife. "I've been watching, Mom. I've seen you move her pills around, hide them in weird places. Why would you do that?" Margaret watched her son's face as understanding began to dawn. Slowly, painfully, like sunrise after the longest night. Danny looked from his daughter to his wife, then to his mother, and Margaret could see the exact moment when willful ignorance became impossible to maintain. "Becca," Danny's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me Emma's wrong." "Danny." "Honey, you know how confused your mother's been getting. I was just trying to make sure she took the right doses at the right times." Becca's explanation came out in a rush, desperate and increasingly unconvincing. "Sometimes elderly people forget they've already taken their medication and take more. I was protecting her by hiding them where she couldn't find them." Emma's voice cracked with emotion. "Mom, she could have had a heart attack." The truth hung in the air like smoke, acrid and undeniable. Margaret watched her son process what his daughter was telling him, saw the moment when denial became impossible. "How long?" Danny asked quietly. "How long what?" Becca's voice had developed a hysterical edge. "How long have you been doing this?" The question opened a floodgate. Margaret found herself recounting every incident, every moved bottle, every moment of confusion and self-doubt that Becca's manipulation had caused. Emma added her own observations: the overheard phone calls, the research into assisted living facilities, the strange questions about Margaret's finances. With each revelation, Danny seemed to shrink further into himself. Margaret could see the war happening behind his eyes, love for his wife battling against the evidence of her betrayal, the desire to keep his family intact, crashing against the reality of what that family had become. "Becca." Danny's voice when he finally spoke was unrecognizable, flat, dead, carrying the weight of dreams dying in real time. "Why?" And that's when Becca's careful mask finally shattered completely. Because she has everything. The words exploded out of her with years of suppressed resentment. This house, the business, all that money, and she just sits here feeling sorry for herself while we struggle to pay our bills. Margaret felt the last illusion of family harmony crumble to dust. This wasn't about care or concern. It was about greed, pure and simple. "We could lose our house, Danny," Becca continued, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I lost my job, we're drowning in debt, and your mother sits on a fortune she'll never use. I was trying to save our family." "By destroying hers?" Emma's voice cut through her mother's justifications with surgical precision. The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Heavier. Final. Margaret looked at her splintered family and realized that some breaks could never be repaired, some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. But in the wreckage of everything she'd thought she knew about the people she loved, Margaret found something unexpected. Her own unshakable strength, reflected in her granddaughter's courage and validated by the truth finally spoken aloud. The battle for her independence was far from over, but at least now she knew exactly what she was fighting against, and who was fighting beside her. The silence that followed Becca's outburst stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law's face cycle through emotions, defiance, desperation, calculation, before settling into something harder and more dangerous than anything she'd seen before. "You know what?" Becca's voice had turned cold, controlled in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Maybe I should call Dr. Patterson myself. Tell him how confused Margaret's been getting, how she's been making wild accusations against family members trying to help her." The threat hung in the kitchen air like poison gas. Margaret felt Emma move closer to her, a 16-year-old girl instinctively placing herself between her grandmother and danger. "That won't be necessary," Margaret said quietly. "I've already been in touch with Detective Chen at the Sheriff's Department." Danny's head snapped up. "The police?" "Elder abuse is a crime, son." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who'd found her footing on uncertain ground. Tampering with someone's medication, manipulating their mental state, attempting to gain control of their assets, all felonies under Tennessee law. Becca's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Who's going to believe that? An elderly woman with obvious signs of dementia making paranoid accusations against the family members caring for her?" "A detective with 15 years of experience recognizing elder abuse patterns," Margaret replied. "A banker who fired you for accessing elderly clients' accounts without authorization. Neighbors who witnessed you going through my mail." Each fact landed like a physical blow. Margaret watched Becca realize that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, that the evidence against her was far more extensive than she'd imagined. "This is insane," Danny said, looking between his wife and mother as if seeing them, both clearly for the first time. "Becca, tell me you didn't really—" "I was trying to protect her." Becca's composure finally cracked. "And protect us. Do you know what it's like watching your family struggle while your mother-in-law hoards money she'll never use?" "It's not hoarding," Emma said, with the brutal honesty only teenagers could manage. "It's called owning your own stuff." Margaret felt a fierce pride in her granddaughter, followed immediately by worry. Becca's desperation was palpable now, and desperate people made dangerous choices. "Danny," Becca turned to her husband with the intensity of someone playing her last card. "You can't let them destroy our family over this. Your mother is clearly having mental issues. She needs help, not police involvement." Margaret watched her son wrestle with the competing loyalties that had defined his adult life. For a moment, she feared he might choose the easier path, the one that avoided confrontation and preserved the illusion of family unity. Then Danny looked at Emma, saw the disappointment and moral clarity in his daughter's eyes, and something shifted in his expression. "Becca," Danny's voice was quiet but final. "Show me your purse." "What?" If you were just organizing Mom's medication to help her, show me what else you have. The standoff lasted 30 seconds that felt like hours. Then Becca grabbed her purse from the counter and upended it, sending contents scattering across Margaret's kitchen table. Pill bottles, bank statements, photocopied documents, evidence of a systematic campaign to document Margaret's incompetence while researching her financial assets. Margaret recognized some of the papers, copies of her insurance policies, bank statements that should have been private, medical records that Becca had no legal right to possess. Jesus Christ, Becca! Danny's voice carried the weight of a man watching his world collapse. What have you done? Before Becca could answer, Margaret's phone rang. Detective Chen's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret answered on speaker, with the confidence of someone who finally held the moral high ground. Mrs. Whitaker, I have an update. We've obtained a warrant to search your daughter-in-law's vehicle and residence based on the evidence of mail tampering and financial exploitation. Becca's face went white. You can't just... Ma'am, Chen's voice carried the authority of law enforcement. If you're present at the residence, I need you to remain calm and cooperate fully. Any attempt to destroy evidence will result in additional charges. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law and saw desperation transform into something closer, to panic. Becca's carefully constructed scheme was unraveling faster than she could adapt, and her next words confirmed Margaret's worst fears about what cornered people were capable of. Fine, Becca said, her voice deadly calm. But if you want to play this game, let's play it properly. She turned to Danny with the cold precision of someone cutting all remaining ties. Your mother is clearly suffering from paranoid delusions brought on by dementia. I've been documenting her decline for months, and I have medical professionals who will testify to her incompetence. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. What medical professionals? Dr. Richards at the geriatric clinic has been very concerned about the reports I've shared with him about your behavior. The missed appointments, the medication confusion, the wild accusations against family members. Becca's smile was sharp as broken glass. He's already prepared to recommend a competency evaluation. The room tilted slightly. Margaret realized that while she'd been gathering evidence against Becca, her daughter-in-law had been building a counter-narrative with professional support. The game was more complex than she'd understood. That's fraud, Emma said, her young voice cutting through the adult complications with devastating simplicity. Lying to doctors is fraud. Is it lying when I'm genuinely concerned about my mother-in-law's mental state? Becca asked with poisonous sweetness. When she's making paranoid accusations against the people trying to help her? Margaret felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, not from her heart condition, but from the recognition that Becca's backup plan was already in motion. How many medical professionals had been fed false information about her mental state? How many? Reports existed documenting her supposed decline. There's one problem with your story. Frank Morrison's voice came from the kitchen doorway. Margaret turned to see her lawyer entering without invitation, his expression grimmer than she'd ever seen it. Mr. Morrison? Becca said carefully. I didn't realize you were expected. I wasn't. I was driving by when I saw the detective's car. Frank's eyes took in the scattered contents of Becca's purse, the tense family tableau, the obvious confrontation in progress. But I'm glad I stopped. It gives me a chance to share some interesting information. Frank moved to the table and began photographing the scattered documents with his phone. Funny thing about Dr. Richards at the geriatric clinic. When I called his office this morning to verify the reports you've been making about Margaret, his nurse was very surprised. Seems they have no record of you ever contacting them about a patient named Margaret Whitaker. Becca's face went from pale to gray. That's impossible. I spoke with them several times. The clinic you contacted, Frank continued with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence, is in Kentucky. Interestingly, they're not licensed to practice in Tennessee. which makes any evaluation they might provide legally worthless. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law's final gambit crumble in real time. Becca had been so desperate to create professional support for her narrative that she'd fabricated medical consultations, apparently not realizing that lawyers like Frank knew how to verify such claims. "You set this up," Becca whispered, her voice carrying the hollow sound of someone watching their last hope die. "No," Margaret said quietly. "You set this up. All of it. I just refuse to let you get away with it." The sound of vehicles in the driveway announced Detective Chen's arrival with what Margaret assumed was the search warrant. Through the kitchen window, she could see official cars, uniformed officers, the machinery of justice finally turning in her favor. But as she looked at her fractured family, her son's devastated expression, Emma's frightened but determined face, Becca's cornered desperation, Margaret realized that victory in this battle would come at a cost she was only beginning to understand. Some betrayals cut too deep for healing. Some families couldn't survive the truth. The question now wasn't whether justice would be served, but whether anything worth saving would remain when the legal dust finally settled. Detective Chen's footsteps on the front porch triggered Becca's final transformation. The desperate woman, who'd been exposed moments before, disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose. "I can't live with this," Becca whispered, her voice taking on a hollow quality that made Margaret's skin crawl. "If you destroy me, you destroy Emma's future. Is that what you want?" The implied threat hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Margaret had seen this tactic before, the suggestion of self-harm used as a weapon against those who dared to hold abusers accountable. "Becca, don't!" Danny pleaded, his voice breaking with the weight of a man watching his world collapse. "We'll figure this out. We'll get help." "What help?" Becca's laugh carried a bitter edge. "Your mother has made sure there's no coming back from this. She's chosen her money over our family." Emma stepped forward, her young face hard with moral clarity. "Stop using me as an excuse. Stop pretending this is about anyone but you." Detective Chen entered without ceremony, her presence immediately shifting the room's dynamic from family drama to criminal investigation. "Mrs. Rebecca Whitaker, I have a warrant to search these premises." Becca's mask slipped completely. "This is all because of a confused old woman's paranoid delusions. Any evidence you find is meaningless." "Ma'am, the evidence includes testimony from bank employees, postal workers, and medical professionals," Chen replied calmly. "Multiple independent sources." Frank Morrison stepped forward, gesturing to the scattered contents of Becca's purse. "Detective, you'll find additional evidence here. Documents Mrs. Whitaker had no legal right to possess." Margaret watched Becca realize her carefully constructed world was crumbling beyond repair. The photocopied bank statements, stolen medical records, and pill bottles created an undeniable pattern of systematic abuse. "I was trying to protect her." Becca's composure finally shattered. She's old, confused, and someone needed to make decisions before she hurt herself. "By hiding her heart medication?" Chen's question cut through the justifications. "By creating the very confusion you claim to be protecting her from." "I never meant—" Becca stopped, recognizing that every word was becoming evidence against her. Emma's voice broke the silence, steady despite her tears. "Mom, just stop lying, please." Becca looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and something died behind her eyes. "You want the truth? Your grandmother chose her pride over our family's survival. She has the power to save us and won't." "Mrs. Whitaker," Chen said formally, "you're under arrest for elder abuse and financial exploitation." As handcuffs clicked into place, Becca made one final attempt at manipulation. "Danny, don't let her destroy us. Think about Emma's future." But Danny was already looking at Emma, seeing the premature wisdom in her eyes, understanding finally that protecting his daughter meant choosing truth over comfort. "No, Becca," he said quietly. "We destroyed ourselves." As police cars pulled away, Margaret stood with her son and granddaughter in the aftermath of necessary devastation. Justice had been served, but the family that remained would need time to heal from wounds that went deeper than any single betrayal. Emma squeezed Margaret's hand. "You did the right thing, Grandma Maggie." Margaret nodded, though she knew that doing right and feeling right weren't always the same thing. The battle was won, but the war for their family's soul was just beginning. 3 weeks after Becca's arrest, Margaret sat in Frank Morrison's office watching her daughter-in-law's attorney present a plea agreement that felt both like victory and hollow consolation. 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, restitution for financial damages, and a restraining order that prohibited contact with Margaret for 5 years. "She's getting off easy," Emma said from the chair beside Margaret, her 16-year-old sense of justice demanding harsher consequences. Frank adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "Prison time would have meant years of appeals, testimony that would force you to relive this trauma repeatedly. Sometimes justice looks like ending the threat, not maximizing punishment." Margaret studied the legal documents that officially restored her autonomy. Full control of her finances and medical care, validation from court-ordered psychiatric evaluation proving her complete mental competence, and most importantly, the legal recognition that she'd been the victim, not the problem. "What happens to Danny and Emma now?" Margaret asked. "That's up to them," Frank replied gently. "And up to you." The question had haunted Margaret since Becca's arrest. Danny had filed for divorce immediately, his lawyer citing irreconcilable differences and criminal behavior. But the man who'd emerged from his wife's manipulation was broken, struggling with guilt over his willful blindness and the collapse of everything he'd thought he knew about his life. "He blames himself," Margaret said quietly. "He should." Emma's voice carried the brutal honesty of youth. "But that doesn't mean he can't do better." Through Frank's office window, Margaret could see Danny's truck pulling into the parking lot. They'd arranged this meeting carefully, neutral ground where they could begin figuring out how to be a family again. Danny entered looking older than his 40 years, wearing the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. He'd lost 15 pounds, Frank had mentioned, wasn't sleeping well, had taken leave from work to handle the divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. "Mom." Danny's voice carried the hesitation of someone no longer sure of his welcome. "How are you?" "I'm alive," Margaret replied, and the simple truth of it seemed to hit Danny like a physical blow. Which is more than might have been the case if this had continued. Emma stood and wrapped her arms around her father, and Margaret watched. Danny break down in his daughter's embrace. The tears came from somewhere deeper than grief, from the recognition of how close he'd come to losing everything that actually mattered. "I'm sorry," Danny whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom." Margaret rose from her chair and joined the embrace, feeling her son's shoulders shake with the weight of delayed understanding. "I know you are. The question is what we do now." Over the next hour, they worked out the framework of rebuilding. Danny would continue counseling, would complete the court-mandated program for family members involved in elder abuse cases. Emma would split time between her father's apartment and Margaret's house, providing connection while maintaining boundaries. "I want to help," Danny said finally. "With the house, with anything you need. I want to earn back your trust." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the weak man who'd enabled his wife's abuse, but the boy who'd once defended smaller children from playground bullies. People could change, could grow, could choose to be better than their worst moments. "Trust isn't earned back," Margaret said carefully. "It's built new, from the ground up. Are you willing to do that work?" Danny nodded, his eyes clear for the first time in months. "Whatever it takes." As they prepared to leave Frank's office, Emma slipped her hand into Margaret's. Grandma Maggie, are you going to be okay? Really okay? Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's hand, feeling the strength that had carried her through the darkest months of her life. I'm going to be better. Then okay. I'm going to be free. The afternoon sun felt warm on Margaret's face as they walked to their cars. The legal battle was over, but the real work, rebuilding trust, healing wounds, learning to be family again, was just beginning. But for the first time since Harold's death, Margaret felt truly hopeful about the future. 6 months after Becca's arrest, Margaret Rose Whitaker stood in her kitchen on her 73rd birthday, surrounded by people who had earned their place at her table through actions rather than blood. Detective Sarah Chen helped Emma arrange flowers while Patty Williams bustled around the counter, her protective instincts now channeled into ensuring Margaret's birthday cake was perfect. Frank Morrison sat at Harold's old chair, but somehow, it felt right now, not like replacement, but like continuity. Remember when you thought I was losing my mind? Margaret asked Patty as they set the table with Harold's good china, pieces that had survived decades of family dinners and would outlast whatever came next. Patty paused in her task, her expression growing serious. I remember being afraid I was watching another family destroy someone I cared about. I've seen it too many times. Good people convinced they're going crazy when really they're being systematically abused. The kitchen filled with the comfortable noise of people who genuinely cared for each other. Margaret marveled at how different this felt from the tense family gatherings of the past year, when every conversation had carried undercurrents of manipulation and hidden agendas. Danny arrived precisely at 5, carrying a wrapped package, and wearing the cautious optimism of someone still earning his way back into trust. His face had regained some color over the past months, and the haunted look that had followed Becca's arrest was slowly being replaced by something that might eventually become peace. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the warmth. She remembered from before everything went wrong. "I brought something I thought you might want back." Margaret unwrapped the package carefully, her breath catching when she saw Harold's old toolbox, the one Becca had somehow convinced Danny to store in their garage for safekeeping. Inside, everything was exactly as Harold had left it. His favorite hammer, the level that had built half the houses in their neighborhood, the small hand tools that had shaped their life together. She was going to sell them, Danny said quietly. "I found the appraisal papers when I was cleaning out the house. I'm sorry it took me so long to bring them back." Margaret ran her fingers over the worn handle of Harold's favorite screwdriver, feeling the connection to the man who'd built their life with patience and steady hands. "Thank you," she said simply, and watched Danny's shoulders relax with relief. Emma bounced into the kitchen carrying a poster board covered with newspaper clippings and printed articles. "Grandma Maggie, look what I found for my school project." The poster documented Margaret's story, but also stories of other elder abuse, survivors who had found the courage to speak out. Emma had interviewed Detective Chen about warning signs, had researched statistics about financial exploitation, had created a comprehensive guide for recognizing and reporting elder abuse. "I'm calling it Hidden in Plain Sight: How Families Can Protect Each Other," Emma explained with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling. "My teacher says it's good enough to enter in the state competition." Margaret studied her granddaughter's work, seeing not just a school project, but evidence of how trauma could be transformed into purpose. Emma had taken the worst experience of their family's life and turned it into something that might help others avoid the same fate. "You know," Frank said, looking up from the poster, "there's a real need for this kind of education in our community. The senior center has been asking me about hosting workshops on elder abuse prevention." "I've been thinking about that," Margaret said, surprising herself with the words. "About sharing what happened to us. It feels wrong to keep quiet when other families might be going through the same thing." Detective Chen nodded approvingly. "The more people understand how these schemes work, the harder it becomes for abusers to succeed. Your story could save someone else from what you went through. As they sat down to dinner, Margaret looked around the table at faces that had become her chosen family. Patty, who'd validated her concerns when her own son wouldn't listen. Frank, who'd fought for her legal rights with the dedication of a true friend. Sarah, who'd taken her seriously when she could have been dismissed as a confused elderly woman. Emma, who'd chosen truth over family loyalty when it mattered most. And Danny, working every day to become the man he should have been all along. "I want to propose a toast," Margaret said, raising her glass of sweet tea. "To the difference between being managed and being loved." "To fighting back," Emma added with fierce pride. "To second chances," Danny said quietly. "To the strength it takes to ask for help," Patty contributed. "To justice served," Sarah offered. "To new beginnings," Frank concluded. As they clinked glasses, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death: genuine contentment. Not the fragile peace that came from avoiding conflict, but the deep satisfaction of someone who'd fought for her truth and won. After dinner, as Emma helped clear the dishes, she paused beside Margaret's chair. "Grandma Maggie, are you really okay? Like, completely okay?" Margaret considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened widow questioning her own sanity, isolated and vulnerable. Tonight, she was surrounded by people who respected her autonomy while offering genuine support. "I'm better than okay," Margaret said, echoing the words she'd spoken in Frank's office. "I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." Later, after the guests had gone and Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, Margaret sat in Harold's old recliner and looked out at the mountains that had watched over her family for decades. The house felt different now, not just a place where she existed, but a home where she belonged. Tomorrow she would call the senior center about hosting those workshops Frank had mentioned. She would share her story not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor offering hope. Because the most powerful weapon against predators like Becca wasn't silence or shame. It was truth spoken clearly by people brave enough to say, "This happened to me, and it doesn't have to happen to you." The mountain air carried the promise of spring. And Margaret Rose Whitaker settled into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had not just survived, but transformed. The battle for her independence was over. The work of helping others win their own battles was just beginning. 1 year after finding her first misplaced heart medication, Margaret Rose Whitaker stood before a packed auditorium at the Cumberland County Senior Center, her voice steady as she reached the conclusion of a presentation that had already changed 3 lives in the audience. "The warning signs aren't always obvious," Margaret said, looking out at faces that ranged from skeptical to deeply concerned. "Family members who insist on managing your medications, offers to help with your finances that come with subtle pressure to surrender control, the gradual isolation from friends and independent activities, all disguised as loving concern." In the front row, Detective Sarah Chen nodded approvingly. Beside her, Frank Morrison took notes for the legal pamphlet they were developing together. OICR, simple guide that seniors could keep handy, written in plain language that cut through legal jargon to deliver life-saving information. "The hardest part," Margaret continued, "is trusting yourself when people you love tell you that you're wrong. When your own family suggests that your concerns are signs of mental decline. That's when you need outside voices, professionals who can see the situation clearly." A hand shot up in the middle section. Margaret recognized Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary, a woman whose independence had been a source of community admiration for decades. "What if the person doing this is your only family?" Miss Henderson asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone grappling with impossible choices. "What if speaking up means losing everyone you have left?" Margaret felt the familiar flutter in her chest, not from her heart condition, but from recognition of the isolation that had nearly consumed her own life. Then you discover that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about respect and genuine care. And sometimes losing toxic family members is the only way to find the people who truly belong in your life. After the presentation, 3 seniors approached Margaret privately. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over whispered about her nephew's sudden interest in her Social Security checks. Mr. Williams described his daughter-in-law's insistence on accompanying him to every doctor's appointment, her careful control of the information that reached his physician. Most heartbreaking was elderly Mrs. Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, who described a granddaughter who'd moved in to help, but seemed more interested in cataloging valuable items than providing care. "What do I do?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice trembling with the same confusion and self-doubt Margaret remembered so well. "You start by trusting yourself," Margaret replied, handing her Detective Chen's card. "And you document everything, every incident, every conversation, every time someone moves your things or speaks for you without permission." Frank Morrison joined them, his gentle manner putting the worried seniors at ease. "We've started a support group," he explained. "People who've been through similar situations, meeting weekly to share experiences and resources. You don't have to figure this out alone." As the crowd dispersed, Emma approached with the quiet pride of someone watching a beloved family member fulfill their destiny. Now 17 and bound for college with plans to study social work, Emma had become Margaret's unofficial research assistant, helping compile statistics and stories that made their presentations more compelling. "Grandma Maggie, Mrs. Patterson," already called Detective Chen. "She's filing a report about her nephew tonight." Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from turning personal trauma into protective action. Each person who found the courage to speak up was a victory not just for them, but for the community that was slowly learning to recognize and resist elder abuse. Danny appeared beside them, carrying the folding table they used to display resource materials. His presence at these events had been gradual, first just helping with logistics, then sharing his perspective as a family member who'd failed to recognize abuse, finally becoming an advocate himself for the children and spouses of elder abuse victims. "Mom," Danny said quietly, "I wanted you to know. Becca sent a letter through her lawyer. She's completed the court-mandated counseling and wanted to apologize." Margaret studied her son's face, reading the complex emotions there. Danny had grown into the man she'd always hoped he could be, but the scars from his marriage would always remain. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret asked. "Angry, sad, relieved that she's getting help." Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. "But mostly grateful that you were strong enough to fight back when I wasn't." A young woman approached their table, interrupting the family moment. She introduced herself as a reporter from the Nashville newspaper, interested in writing about Margaret's advocacy work and the growing awareness of elder abuse in rural Tennessee communities. "What drives you to keep sharing your story?" the reporter asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Margaret considered the question, thinking about the journey from that first morning when she couldn't find her heart medication to this evening when she'd potentially saved 3 more seniors from similar betrayal. "Because silence protects predators," Margaret said finally. "And because I discovered something important when I fought for my independence, I'm stronger than I ever knew. If sharing that strength helps others find their own, then every difficult moment was worth it." As they packed up the presentation materials, Detective Chen approached with news that made Margaret's heart lift with pride and purpose. "We got a call from Knoxville. They want you to speak at their Elder Abuse Prevention Conference next month. Your story is creating ripples across the state." Later that evening, Margaret sat in Harold's old recliner with a cup of tea and a stack of thank you letters from seniors who'd attended previous presentations. Each letter was a testament to the power of speaking truth, of refusing to be silenced by shame or fear. Emma curled up on the couch with her laptop, working on college applications that would take her away from Tennessee, but also spread the lessons she'd learned about standing up for justice. Danny had gone home to his small apartment, but not before helping Margaret organize next week's presentation materials, a ritual that had become their way of rebuilding trust through shared purpose. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Heard your presentation helped my grandmother. Thank you for giving her the courage to ask for help. You saved her life." She set the phone aside and looked around her living room, the same space where Becca had once rearranged her belongings and questioned her competence. Now it was filled with the tools of advocacy, presentation folders, resource guides, contact information for law enforcement and social services. The transformation felt complete. Outside, the Tennessee mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but Margaret Rose Whitaker had been transformed by fire into something new and powerful. She was no longer just a retired librarian or grieving widow. She was a force for justice, a voice for the voiceless, a woman who'd discovered that survival could become service. Tomorrow would bring new presentations, new seniors seeking help, new families learning to recognize the difference between care and control. Margaret would meet each challenge with the strength she'd discovered in her darkest hour, the unshakable knowledge that truth, spoken clearly and without apology, could change the world one person at a time. The battle for her own independence was over. The war for everyone else's had just begun, and Margaret Rose Whitaker was ready to fight as long as her voice could carry and her heart could beat. Some stories ended with victims finding peace. This one ended with a survivor finding purpose. And that, Margaret thought as she turned off the lights and headed to bed, made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.